We begin our journey just beyond the desolate plains of Mordor, where the horizon rises in a distant, dark silhouette. The land is a study in contrasts, scorched stretches of earth broken by jagged hills, volcanic ridges, and the occasional glint of mineral veins that hint at ancient, hidden strength. From this vantage, Barad-dûr itself is scarcely more than a shadow among shadows, its height suggested rather than declared, yet its presence shapes every fold of the land. The eye is drawn naturally upward, following the subtle incline of the plains, toward the ominous peak, a natural prelude to the story of its foundations. The land here has long memories, and even before the tower's stones rose, whispers of prior ages lingered in the soil, the wind, and the deep stillness that marks places touched by power beyond the ordinary. The first age of Middle-earth left indelible traces in this region, a subtle palimpsest of old bargains and broken covenants. Long before Sauron's return, the shadows of Morgoth's forges stretched across the northern landscapes, leaving fissures not only in rock, but in the very fabric of reality. These fissures are subtle, imperceptible to those who traverse the plains in daylight, yet they exist as conduits of power, channels through which memory, despair, and latent malice flow. In these ancient echoes, Sauron would later perceive opportunity, the chance to build atop not only the earth, but the lingering influence of earlier evils. In selecting this ground, he recognized that the foundations of a tower, like the foundations of a spell or a covenant, are as critical as what rests upon them. A poor choice of ground can undermine ambition, yet here, the land itself carried a history that could be harnessed, twisted, and reinforced. The plains of Mordor seem empty at first, but the emptiness is deceptive. The valleys between volcanic spines conceal ancient ruins, crumbled fortresses, half-buried obsidian walls, and remnants of structures whose architects had vanished long before Sauron's rise. Among these are echoes of Thangorodrim, the three jagged peaks that once watched over Angband, Morgoth's prison fortress. Though Thangorodrim itself was shattered and scattered, its shadow persists in the landscape, in both the physical contours of the hills and in the subtle reverberations of spiritual energy. Sauron's choice of site reflects a rare clarity. He did not merely build on neutral soil, but over the veins of power left by past wars and ancient sorceries. These traces are not inert. They are active, waiting for an able hand to call them into purpose. Sauron's strategy is as much psychological as it is architectural. From this distance, the looming shadow of Barad-dûr serves as both warning and attraction. The land beneath it is already telling a story of weight and consequence. Power accumulates where others have struggled and fallen. And here, every ridge and hollow carries memory. Those who live in the plains, whether the scattered orcs, the enslaved peoples of Mordor, or even wandering creatures of darker origin, sense it instinctively. The presence of something greater than themselves imposes order even on disorder, a quiet gravity that draws attention and obedience alike. Sauron understands that the perception of inevitability is nearly as potent as the reality of strength, and that perception is first anchored in the choice of ground. Yet, with the allure of power comes its cost. The very act of layering new dominion over old fractures carries consequences. Where the First Age left fissures, Sauron's ambition deepened them. Magic woven into the soil disrupts natural rhythms. Latent horrors once confined begin to stir beneath the surface. These effects are subtle, imperceptible in the daylight, yet persistent. Winds carry whispers of unrest, small tremors echo in the hills, and the sun seems to falter behind clouds that cling stubbornly to the peaks. This interplay of natural and unnatural forces establishes the rhythm of the region long before construction begins. The cost of occupying these grounds is immediate in a metaphysical sense. Every step upon the plains resonates with ancient echoes of suffering. Every act of shaping the land interacts with forces older than any living being. Even as the plains stretch outward in barren majesty, there are signs of Sauron's early manipulations. Observing the valleys, one might notice the way certain rock formations seem unnaturally aligned, guiding sightlines toward the eventual tower site. Streams, once free-flowing, have been subtly redirected, carving channels that will later support siege works, roads, and hidden cisterns. The land is not merely a canvas, it is an active participant in the construction of terror. This subtle preparation, largely invisible to casual observers, exemplifies a guiding principle of Sauron's methods. Work with what is already present, then amplify it through design, ritual, and intent. It is a layering process, both physical and metaphysical, that integrates the past into the present for strategic advantage. As shadows lengthen in the late afternoon, the plains take on a quiet, reflective stillness. This is the moment where one senses the invisible threads that will later bind the tower to the earth, and to the very psyche of Middle-earth. The whispering remnants of previous ages, the sun-streaked obsidian, and the distant hum of dormant energies create a subtle tension, not alarming but insistent. Sauron's choice of location is deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each step toward the site, each stone later laid in its foundations, resonates with a history that predates him by millennia. By recognizing and exploiting these hidden histories, Sauron ensures that Barad-dûr's power is anchored not in surface, might alone, but in deep, enduring forces that ripple far beyond immediate observation. Breadcrumbs for the attentive listener emerge even now. The vestiges of Thangorodrim, hints of Morgoth's lingering influence, and the subtle alignment of terrain that later shapes siege strategy. These threads, understated yet persistent, promise further revelations as the story of Barad-dûr's foundations unfolds. Understanding why Sauron chose this particular ground will later illuminate the mechanisms of power and the costs exacted by dominion over both land and life. For now, the plains remain vast, desolate, and deceptively still, holding secrets beneath layers of rock, shadow, and history. In the distance, the silhouette of Barad-dûr continues to dominate the horizon, a faint promise of architecture yet to rise. The journey into the horrors beneath the tower is only beginning. We have observed the land, traced its memory, and begun to perceive the weight of ancestral bargains. The next stage of our exploration must ask a crucial question. What did Sauron see in this place that others had overlooked, and how did he manipulate the hidden layers beneath it to serve his unrelenting ambition? It is the answer to this question that will lead us deeper into the subterranean history, where stone, shadow, and ritual converge to form the heart of Mordor's enduring power. From the sun-scorched plains of Mordor, our perspective shifts downward into the hidden veins and caverns that lace the land beneath. The surface, harsh and barren though it appears, is only the first layer of a far more intricate terrain. Beneath, tunnels of volcanic origin twist and fork like the roots of a dead tree, leading into dark chambers that have lain undisturbed for ages. In these spaces, natural heat mingles with residue of arcane energy, creating a subtle hum that seems to echo the memory of ancient deeds. Here, the earth itself preserves the shadows of history, a record not written in words, but etched into stone, mineral, and the faint vibration of lingering sorceries. As we trace these subterranean corridors, it becomes clear that the land remembers. Every fissure, hollow, and ridge has been touched by previous wars, by the ambitions of those who sought dominion long before Sauron's rise. Volcanic tubes provide the earliest evidence of natural power beneath Mordor. Hollowed by fire and pressure over countless centuries, these tunnels form conduits for heat, gas, and subtle elemental forces. Yet Sauron's genius lies in perceiving these ordinary features as more than geological accidents. To him, each passage is a channel waiting to be aligned with conscious will, a network through which the tower's influence might reach both the surface and the hidden world beneath. These passages were not simply dug out. They are inherent instruments of power, conduits capable of carrying the echoes of ancient spells and enhancing the resonance of future enchantments. The cost of such alignment, though subtle, is significant. The natural balance of the land is altered, the geomantic equilibrium disturbed. And minor but persistent, corruptions spread outward from each point of manipulation. Old crypts, hidden chambers that predate even the earliest kingdoms of men and elves, further illustrate the latent potential beneath the surface. Many were carved in the ages of war and ambition, repositories for relics, weapons, or the bones of the dead. Even abandoned, these crypts retain a memory of the intentions and fears of those who first built them. It is in the residual energies, tension, hope, fear, that Sauron discerns opportunity. By situating his forces in alignment with these pre-existing chambers, he ensures that the magic of Barad-dûr is layered over centuries of unspent intent, intensifying the tower's resonance. However, this layering is not without cost. The deeper the tower reaches into the Earth's memory, the more it interacts with unresolved energies, disturbing local currents of life and spirit, seeding minor distortions that ripple outward invisibly across the plains. Walking through these caverns, one senses a persistent hum, almost musical, as if the stone itself is aware of history. It is not sound as we know it, but vibration, the subtle pulse of latent force. Here and there, faint inscriptions appear in blackened rock, etched by hands long vanished. Their meanings are obscured, but the presence of these relics hints at bargains struck, powers captured, and failures endured. Such artifacts serve as breadcrumbs, foreshadowing the mechanisms that Sauron later exploits. A casual traveler might overlook them entirely, but to one attuned to the layering of intent and magic, they signal a landscape dense with possibility. Each glyph, each carved symbol, is a quiet reminder that the world beneath Mordor has long been a repository of both ambition and consequence. Sauron's approach to these hidden spaces reflects his understanding of subtle leverage. Rather than creating entirely new subterranean networks, he enhances and redirects those already present. Streams of geothermal heat are guided along specific paths, amplifying resonance points beneath the future tower. Gas pockets, naturally generated by volcanic activity, are contained and channeled to reinforce structural enchantments and defensive wards. These actions are carefully calibrated. Too aggressive an alteration could rupture the latent energies or provoke unforeseen consequences. The cost, in every case, is measured in incremental corruption, shifts in the subtle currents of power, and the quiet destabilization of creatures and plants that inhabit these depths. Yet Sauron deems the trade worthwhile, for each adjustment strengthens the foundation upon which Barad-dûr will rise. The alignment of these subterranean networks with magical intent is not purely technical. It carries psychological weight as well. Those who traverse the upper planes of Mordor sense something unsettling beneath them, though they cannot name it. Orcs, trolls, and other servants of Sauron are subtly affected by these currents, their moods and energies shifting without clear cause. The earth beneath imposes order, even if that order is invisible, bending the will of sentient beings toward the tower's purposes. Sauron's genius lies in recognizing the duality of influence. The hidden corridors channel power into the structure while simultaneously shaping the behavior of those above, ensuring obedience, vigilance, and fear. The cost is diffuse but real, extending beyond the physicals into moral and psychic territory. Amid the volcanic tubes and crypts, there are also voids where the echoes of Morgoth linger. The master of Angband left behind not only stone and ruin, but enduring residues of intent and malevolence. These remnants are faint, barely perceptible, yet they carry weight. They are the whispers of older bargains, long-abandoned wars, and shattered dominions. Sauron recognizes them for what they are, dormant forces that can be reawakened and harnessed if carefully guided. The risk, however, is inherent. Any attempt to control such remnants may backfire, releasing energies not entirely his own. Here, as beneath all of Mordor, power is inseparable from the hidden price. Even the air in these caverns carries a record of history. Particles suspended in heat and mineral-laden dust vibrate faintly with long-forgotten energies, contributing to the subtle hum that seems to permeate the tunnels. Each inhalation is a small communion with the past, a whisper of covenant, betrayal, and ruin. Sauron's understanding of such subtlety allows him to integrate the natural and supernatural, weaving corridors of stone, channels of heat, and veins of ancient energy into a unified lattice. These underground preparations are not merely supportive, they are foundational. They create a base upon which the weight of Barad-dûr, both physical and metaphysical, will rest. Breadcrumbs abound for those paying attention. Inscriptions, fragments of relics, traces of mineral manipulation, and the alignment of natural conduits all hint at the mechanisms that Sauron will later exploit. Each is a quiet reminder that the surface alone tells only part of the story. The tower's power and horror are rooted beneath the ground, in places largely inaccessible to eyes untrained in the perception of layered histories. These underground echoes foreshadow both the strength and the vulnerabilities of Barad-dûr, linking the visible threat above with the hidden currents below. As we leave the immediate vicinity of the caverns and begin to ascend toward the plains once more, the significance of these subterranean structures becomes clear. They are not merely empty tunnels or geological accidents. They are a living, responsive network, shaped by both natural processes and Sauron's careful manipulations. They record history, transmit influence, and prepare the foundation for what will become the greatest stronghold in Middle-earth. The next chapter will explore how Sauron translated this subterranean knowledge into the deliberate construction of Barad-dûr itself, integrating horrors from below with the architecture above, and demonstrating how the hidden layers of the land shaped the surface of his dominion. From the hidden veins and cryptic chambers beneath Mordor, our attention rises to the tangible beginnings of Barad-dûr itself. The tower's foundations were not laid as ordinary stone might be, nor as any fortress of men or elves had been erected. Here, each block, each carefully fitted piece, represents the convergence of masonry, arcane craft, and the careful manipulation of the land's latent energies. The ground itself, already suffused with memories of ancient wars, bargains, and unrest, becomes both instrument and participant in the construction. Sauron's engineers, both mortal and otherwise, were guided by knowledge that combined engineering, precision, with a dark intuition of metaphysical resonance. Every decision about placement, orientation, and connection drew from an understanding that the tower's might could not exist independently of the soil, the rock, and the lingering energies that threaded through it. The foundations were first stabilized through layers of stone sourced from the surrounding volcanic ridges. Each boulder was chosen not only for weight and durability, but for the subtle mineral qualities that harmonized with the subterranean conduits beneath. The engineers recognized points where the natural heat and faint magical currents converged, reinforcing them through careful positioning. Into these stones, ritualized imprints were carved, sigils and symbols designed to bind power into the very structure of the tower. These imprints are subtle, almost invisible to casual observation, yet they act as conduits through which latent energies are anchored, focused, and amplified. The stone, in effect, becomes a repository of accumulated force, a lattice capable of bearing not only the physical weight of Barad-dûr, but also the immaterial pressures of dread and dominion. Binding latent horrors into the foundations was perhaps the most extraordinary and perilous of all tasks. In the caverns below, spirits and remnants of long-dead evils were coaxed, restrained, and incorporated into the structure through ritual. This was neither straightforward nor entirely safe. Spirits resist confinement, and each attempt to harness their energy frayed the natural and moral order of the surrounding land. Trees withered, streams darkened, and the subtle vibrations of living creatures shifted in response. Yet, with each successful binding, the tower gained an almost self-perpetuating presence, a silent, pervasive influence that extended beyond its walls. It is here that we first glimpse the cost of dominion. The enchantments that support Barad-dûr are simultaneously acts of corruption, echoing outward and leaving traces of imbalance for generations to come. The process of reinforcing stone through magic is both technical and symbolic. Stone is layered, chiseled, and polished in patterns aligned to subterranean currents, and enchantments are performed to resonate with the particular minerals and energies present. These rituals, precise and lengthy, require careful attention to cadence, timing, and the repetition of subtle words of power. Even minor errors in execution could destabilize a section of foundation or weaken the resonance of a sigil, producing localized but significant disruptions. Yet each success strengthens the tower in multiple dimensions, materially, magically, and psychologically. Workers, observers, and enemies alike sense its latent strength even before the first spire pierces the sky, and this sense reinforces obedience and fear across the plains. it is impossible to overstate the importance of alignment. Foundations laid without consideration for the pre-existing flows of energy would not merely fail to support the tower. They could generate instability, drawing unanticipated forces into conflict with one another. Sauron's designs reflect careful integration of old and new. The foundations mirror the natural curves of subterranean channels, the remains of ancient fortresses, and the subtle marks left by earlier sorceries. This approach ensures that Barad-dûr is not simply built atop the land, but is part of it, a structure inseparable from the forces that underpin it. In doing so, the tower becomes both a symbol and an instrument, a device of power that cannot exist independently of its hidden substratum. Within the stone and beneath the foundations, sigils are etched deep, some so subtle that they are perceptible only through prolonged attunement or heightened awareness. These symbols serve multiple purposes. They stabilize the magical lattice, bind spirits, and act as markers for later rituals. Their presence is a breadcrumb trail for those who come after, indicating the deliberate layering of influence and hinting at forces imprisoned within. Similarly, the alignment of stone, corridors, and elemental conduits foreshadows mechanisms that we will later observe in the functioning of the tower as a nexus of power. These layers demonstrate how Sauron wove together craftsmanship, sorcery, and the exploitation of pre-existing horrors to achieve a singularly formidable structure. The costs of these operations ripple quietly outward. Each enchantment disturbs local geomancy. Every spirit bound into stone imposes tension upon the surrounding terrain. Over time, these tensions accumulate, contributing to subtle shifts in topography, temperature, and even the behavior of living creatures. Streams shift course slightly, winds carry faint, unsettling harmonics, and the plains around the tower seem to bear the weight of unseen influence. Sauron accepts these consequences as part of the necessary investment, understanding that true dominion requires patience, foresight, and a willingness to bear the moral and metaphysical cost of creation. Each layer of stone and magic reinforces the tower above, while deepening the reach of its hidden effects below. The laborers, engineers, and dark craftsmen involved in these foundations were guided but not entirely aware of the full scope of consequences. The combination of precise masonry, enchanted imprints, and spirit-binding rituals creates a lattice that is both visible and invisible, tangible and intangible. To touch the stone is to sense weight, solidity, and geometry. To attune oneself is to sense currents of power, echoes of ancient bargains, and the quiet hum of latent horrors pressed into the architecture. This duality ensures that the tower's foundations operate simultaneously as a functional support and a metaphysical amplifier, capable of projecting dread and influence far beyond the immediate area. By the time the foundations of Barad-dûr were complete, the tower had already begun to assert influence, even before rising above the plains. The land is no longer neutral. It resonates with the tower's emerging presence. Shadows deepen along valleys and ridges. Currents of unseen power twist in subterranean chambers, and even the wind seems to whisper a subtle acknowledgement of Sauron's handiwork. These preparations create a sense of inevitability, not only for those who witness the construction, but for the broader landscape of Mordor itself. The cost is embedded in stone, in air, and in the lives and spirits touched by these foundational processes. Breadcrumbs planted in these foundations, the sigils, the imprisoned spirits, the alignment with ancient energies, will pay dividends as Sauron's dominion grows. They hint at mechanisms to be revealed later. The amplification of magical influence, the resonance of the One Ring, and the eventual fractures that occur when intertwined powers are challenged. These subtle markers remind us that Barad-dûr's might is inseparable from the history it is built upon, and that the choices made during construction carry consequences far beyond the initial act. In tracing the foundations of Barad-dûr, we see clearly that the tower's power is inseparable from its hidden layers. The combination of masonry, magic, and subterranean manipulation creates a lattice of influence that extends far beyond the visible structure. The next chapter will examine the specific bargains and rituals Sauron employed to animate and stabilize these foundations, revealing how his understanding of the land's latent forces informed the tower's enduring, pervasive, and costly power. Beneath the still-rising towers and the weighty stones of Barad-dûr, a quieter, older negotiation unfolded, one invisible to the eye, yet integral to the fortress's power. Sauron's dominion did not rest solely on physical construction or surface intimidation. It was anchored in pacts, bargains struck with entities that existed in the liminal spaces of Middle-earth, spirits of the deep, remnants of Morgoth's long-abandoned. Schemes and subtle traces of elemental forces were approached, assessed, and, where possible, persuaded or coerced into service. These bargains were neither casual nor benign. Each one demanded acknowledgement of cost, whether in the form of energy expended, life disrupted, or subtle shifts in the land's natural order. In forging these connections, Sauron transformed the foundations of Barad-dûr into a lattice of obligation, a network in which power and debt became inseparable. The process of binding entities to architecture is delicate and precise. Rituals are performed to call attention without inviting chaos, to establish a relationship of compulsion rather than cooperation. Symbols etched into stone serve as points of contact, allowing the latent energies of bound spirits to flow into the structure, reinforcing walls, floors, and towers alike. These rituals require attentiveness and timing, for an errant phrase or misaligned gesture could render a bond ineffective, or worse, provoke backlash. The tower's strength is not only material, but metaphysical, emerging from the interactions of these entities pressed into service, each contributing a fraction of their essence to sustain the growing edifice above. Yet the cost of these arrangements is quietly cumulative, a subtle weight that radiates into the surrounding environment. Streams, soil, and even the minds of nearby creatures are touched by the residual force of these bargains. Channeling ambient evil is a further aspect of Sauron's bargains. The remnants of Morgoth's influence persist in fissures, old ruins, and the very minerals of the plains. These residues are inert without direction, but when properly aligned with ritual and architecture, they provide a continual source of reinforcing energy. Sauron's work here is not brute coercion, but orchestration. He identifies the channels, lays the foundation stones upon them, and integrates these invisible currents into the tower's lattice. The costs are subtle, yet insistent. The fertility of land diminishes, the patterns of natural life shift, and perceptual unease extends outward in faint waves, influencing the behavior and emotions of those who dwell nearby. Even before Barad-dûr fully rises, these disturbances mark the surrounding land, a quiet echo of the bargains beneath. In these hidden arrangements, there is a moral and spiritual dimension as well. Each entity, bound or influenced, represents a compromise, a disruption of what might otherwise remain, free or at rest. Sauron's ambition does not permit neutrality. It consumes, co-opts, or converts potential resistance into reinforcement. In doing so, he exacts a toll, not always immediately apparent, yet permanent in its subtle alterations. The land itself absorbs these changes, storing them in ways perceptible only to those attuned to the currents of ancient energy. Over time, the cumulative weight of such bargains becomes a defining feature of Mordor, a landscape imbued with quiet unease where the memory of old covenants and newly imposed servitude coexist in tension beneath the soil and stone. Breadcrumbs of these bargains are etched into the architecture itself. A recurring emblem appears throughout Barad-dûr's design, abstract yet deliberate, a subtle motif repeated in doorways, battlements, and the alignment of towers. This emblem marks not only the presence of bound entities, but the precise points where the tower's lattice of power intersects with the energy of older forces. For the casual observer, it is decoration or coincidence. For the attentive, it is a signal, a thread connecting surface architecture to subterranean bargains. Later, as cracks and stresses appear in the fortress, these emblems will indicate the locations where the tower's integrated energies are most vulnerable, hinting at mechanisms that will eventually unravel under strain. The influence of these bargains extends to those who serve Sauron, often without their full comprehension. Orcs, enslaved men, and other creatures are subtly affected by the currents that flow from bound spirits and residual evil. Their perceptions are shaped, their instincts guided toward obedience and fear, their vitality subtly drawn into the tower's sustaining lattice. This is not coercion in the traditional sense, but an ambient conditioning, a byproduct of proximity to carefully structured metaphysical influence. Even Sauron's lieutenants, powerful and perceptive, feel the gentle yet persistent pressure of the tower's foundations on their thoughts and strategies. The bargains beneath the stone are thus both practical and psychological, extending influence across both the material and moral dimensions of Mordor. Each bargain also carries a potential for instability. A bound spirit may resist, a channel of ambient evil may shift, or the cumulative stress on local geomancy may provoke unexpected effects. Sauron mitigates these risks through repetition, reinforcement, and careful attention to ritual. Yet the very act of layering influence over ancient, morally compromised strata ensures that nothing is entirely predictable. The foundations of Barad-dûr are therefore living structures, in a sense, reactive, responsive, and persistent, capable of sustaining the tower's height and terror, yet quietly reminding all observers that power and cost are inseparable. The metaphysical bargains of Barad-dûr also foreshadow larger consequences. By binding entities and drawing upon residual energies, Sauron ensures that the tower's strength is intertwined with history itself. Future conflicts, sieges, and the eventual confrontation with the forces of the West will be shaped in part by the decisions made during these early rituals. The spirits, symbols, and currents bound beneath the stone become latent actors in the unfolding drama, influencing outcomes in subtle ways, sometimes unnoticed until critical moments. In this sense, the bargains are both an immediate instrument of power and a long-term architect of consequence. As the sun sets over the plains, the quiet weight of these agreements becomes more perceptible. The land seems to thrum softly, a pulse beneath the surface that conveys memory, intent, and anticipation. Sauron's genius lies in harmonizing these hidden layers with the visible structure of the tower, ensuring that Barad-dûr is not only a fortress, but a nexus, a confluence of natural, supernatural, and constructed forces. The bargains embedded in stone and ritual create a lattice that supports both the tower's physical and psychological dominion, shaping the perception and behavior of all who dwell in its shadow. The next chapter will examine the material and architectural consequences of these bargains. How does one translate metaphysical alignment into walls, battlements, and spires? What visible manifestations arise from hidden pacts? By exploring these questions, we will see how the merging of sorcery with masonry creates a structure that is both extraordinary and ominously effective, reflecting the interplay of ambition, cost, and unseen influence that defines Barad-dûr from its foundations to its pinnacle. From the metaphysical bargains and subterranean lattices beneath Barad-dûr, our perspective now rises to the tower itself, to the deliberate shaping of stone into architecture that is at once functional, symbolic, and deeply unnerving. Sauron's fortress was never merely a collection of blocks. It was a carefully choreographed interplay between material weight, geomantic alignment, and the echoes of ancient forces pressed into every foundation. Each stone, each wall, each spire reflects layered knowledge, an understanding of natural currents, magical conduits, and the moral compromises embedded within the land. The architects and sorcerers who contributed to this work combined skill, ritual, and instinct, producing a structure whose presence alone radiates authority and unease. The towers and battlements are aligned with subterranean conduits, allowing currents of power to flow from hidden chambers into the visible edifice. The placement of stones mirrors these paths, with denser rocks chosen at points of heightened energy to stabilize flows and focus resonance. Walls were not only load-bearing, they became vessels for the latent forces embedded beneath the surface, amplifying the effects of rituals performed in the foundations. The interplay of stone and shadow creates an impression of both permanence and menace, a visual and tactile manifestation of the bargains, bindings, and latent horrors that lie beneath. Shadows fall in patterns calculated to unsettle the observer, creating the subtle impression of movement and life, even in moments of stillness. Shadow lore, the deliberate manipulation of perception and light, enhances these architectural effects. Towers cast elongated, angular silhouettes over the plains, guiding the eye and the imagination toward inevitability and dread. Wall surfaces are not uniform. They incorporate irregularities, slight offsets, and textural variations that disrupt natural expectation. These choices, at first unnoticed, heighten tension in the subconscious, reinforcing the psychological influence of Barad-dûr. The combination of shadow, alignment, and symbolic decoration ensures that the tower is more than a physical stronghold. It is an instrument of perception, designed to dominate the minds of those who dwell or traverse nearby. Structural amplification is another mechanism by which the architecture serves metaphysical purposes. Arches, vaults, and spires are calibrated to focus currents of energy, both natural and bound, and to project them outward into the surrounding plains. Certain chambers are deliberately hollowed, their shapes designed to concentrate vibrations from the earth, to reinforce the foundations, and to resonate with the spells and sigils embedded during construction. Even minor elements, doorways, stairwells, or parapets, serve dual roles, supporting both load-bearing requirements and the subtle circulation of energy. Each visible form is therefore inseparable from the hidden forces it channels, a reflection of the layered intentions, knowledge, and compromises that define Barad-dûr. The costs of this architectural integration are profound. Artisans, engineers, and sorcerers alike were taxed to the limits of endurance, working in conditions designed to align both with subterranean currents and the moral compromises imposed by binding spirits. Fatigue is both physical and spiritual. Prolonged exposure to the latent energies beneath the tower subtly erodes vitality, focus, and ethical grounding. Over time, these pressures accumulate, creating delayed but inevitable decay. The land surrounding Barad-dûr absorbs strain as well, subtly shifting, hardening, or distorting in response to the imbalances introduced by construction. Even when walls seem perfect in their geometry, the echoes of these costs remain embedded in the environment, shaping the broader ecology and the experience of those who dwell in Mordor. Within the tower, irregularities in design serve as both protective features and hidden vulnerabilities. The deliberate offset of a spire, the unusual thickness of a wall, or the seemingly arbitrary placement of a stairwell can stabilize energy flows while simultaneously creating focal points for later stress. These irregularities are breadcrumbs for attentive observers, subtle hints that the tower, despite its apparent invincibility, is contingent upon the alignment of forces and the ongoing maintenance of bonds. They foreshadow moments when Barad-dûr's own architecture may amplify vulnerabilities, a concept that will become significant in the unfolding history of Mordor's dominion. Beyond structural concerns, the architecture enforces psychological effects. Long corridors, angled towers, and vast chambers are designed to dwarf the observer, creating a sense of scale that impresses and intimidates. Light and shadow, guided by the tower's geometry, interact with the sun and moon in ways that subtly reinforce notions of inevitability and dread. The fortress communicates without speech or action, asserting authority through presence alone. This psychological amplification operates in concert with the metaphysical lattices below, linking perception and magic into a cohesive experience of control and fear. Sauron's architects also considered the interplay of ecology and architecture. The tower's mass affects wind patterns, channeling gusts through narrow corridors and open courtyards to create subtle auditory cues, from low, resonant hums to faint echoes that travel long distances. These effects are not accidental. They extend the influence of Barad-dûr outward, subtly shaping the behavior of creatures and sentient beings alike. The surrounding plains, already marked by the disturbances of subterranean bargains and binding rituals, respond to the tower's presence. Plants wilt where energy is concentrated. Small animals avoid areas of heightened resonance. Even orcs and enslaved peoples sense shifts in atmosphere and instinctively adjust behavior. In this way, architecture, magic, and ecology form a feedback loop, reinforcing one another quietly but persistently. The symbolic weight of Barad-dûr's architecture is inseparable from its functional purpose. Every element, spires, battlements, parapets, and hidden chambers, reflects the layered knowledge embedded in the foundations, the bargains struck beneath the stone, and the moral compromises that enabled construction. The tower is therefore both weapon and warning. It is a demonstration of mastery over physical and metaphysical space, and a constant reminder of the cost of dominion. To observe it is to recognize the convergence of ambition, labor, magic, and consequence, all of which continue to radiate outward, shaping perception, environment, and history. Breadcrumbs for attentive observers are subtle but persistent. Irregularities in design, slight asymmetries in geometry, and recurring motifs hint at underlying mechanisms and potential vulnerabilities. These signals will gain significance in later chapters, demonstrating how the careful layering of magic, stone, and shadow can both sustain and destabilize a structure. Each architectural choice, however deliberate, carries the imprint of its cost, echoing the bargains, bindings, and sacrifices embedded in the foundations below. The next chapter will explore how these architectural and metaphysical structures influence the broader ecology and psyche of Mordor. We will trace the interactions between stone, magic, and living creatures, revealing the subtle, pervasive ways in which the foundations and architecture of Barad-dûr shape the landscape and all who inhabit it. In doing so, we will see how Sauron's ambitions extend beyond the tower itself into the very mind and environment of Mordor. From the towering spires and meticulously aligned stone of Barad-dûr, our gaze descends to the plains and valleys surrounding Mordor, where the influence of the fortress extends into living systems, quietly shaping the environment. The land itself is responsive, sensitive to the layering of magical currents, bound spirits, and the residual echoes of ancient bargains pressed into the foundations. Grasslands once sparse now bear the weight of subtle distortions, soil darkened, nutrients shifted, and watercourses altered without human notice. Flora and fauna react instinctively, as if sensing a persistent, low-frequency hum of power coursing through the ground. The influence of Barad-dûr is pervasive, yet invisible, a quiet reshaping of the world that mirrors the architectural precision of the tower above. Magical pollution is a primary mechanism through which the tower's foundations assert themselves upon the living environment. Bound entities, trapped spirits, and residual currents of Morgoth's influence radiate outward, interacting with natural cycles. Plants grow in patterns that follow these unseen currents. Some flourish unnaturally, others wither prematurely. Streams darken subtly, carrying mineral traces that hint at the subterranean lattice beneath the surface. Even wind patterns are affected, channeled over ridges and valleys in ways that reinforce psychological tension, producing faint, persistent unease for those who traverse the land. The environment becomes a mirror of the tower's metaphysical presence, extending influence far beyond the visible boundaries of stone and battlement. Psychic bleed accompanies these material distortions. Enslaved peoples, orcs, and wandering creatures of Mordor sense subtle pressure on their thoughts and instincts. Their moods shift in alignment with the hidden currents, fear and obedience subtly amplified. The energy of Barad-dûr permeates consciousness, shaping behavior without overt force, guiding perception and expectation. The subtlety of this psychic influence is key. It is persistent, but non-invasive, more a gentle gravitation of thought than coercion. Through this mechanism, Sauron's dominion is reinforced, not only through architecture and magic, but through the ambient conditioning of all sentient beings in the region. The distortion of natural cycles is another consequence of the tower's presence. Day and night seem slightly imbalanced across the plains. Seasonal transitions are marked by unusual patterns of temperature, wind, and rainfall. Flora bloom or wither in unnatural timing, and fauna adjust migration and breeding patterns subtly, adapting to a rhythm dictated not solely by the sun or the moon, but by the quiet resonance of hidden energies beneath the earth. The cost is cumulative. Ecosystems, though resilient, bear scars in subtle ways. Productivity diminishes in hidden layers of the food chain. Seeds fail to germinate in expected patterns. And the land itself becomes a repository of stress, echoing the moral and magical compromises woven into Barad-dûr's foundations. Amid these patterns, remnants of older fertility persist, faint, and buried beneath the weight of corruption. Ancient soils, once rich and yielding, now lie hidden beneath ash and dark stone, preserving memory of what the land once sustained. These traces serve as breadcrumbs, hinting at the latent potential of the environment and the cost exacted by Sauron's manipulations. When later observers encounter ruins or abandoned stretches of the plains, they may sense these vestiges of life and abundance, unaware of how deeply the underlying structures of the tower have altered the cycles of growth and decay. The land remembers what it has lost, just as the foundations of Barad-dûr preserve what was bound beneath stone. Entropy creeps slowly through these systems. Rocks fracture, soil compacts, and subterranean streams erode channels unpredictably, guided by both natural processes and the influence of magical latticework. The energy embedded in the foundations interacts with these shifts, amplifying them in subtle ways. Small events cascade outward. A fissure expands over decades. A mineral vein weakens under repeated strain, and creatures dependent on the stability of water or soil adjust instinctively, reinforcing the flow of influence radiating from the tower. The cost is nearly imperceptible in the short term, but cumulative over time, producing a landscape marked by quiet instability and persistent tension. Subtle erosion of hope manifests alongside these physical and ecological consequences. Those who inhabit Mordor, enslaved or coerced, feel the persistent weight of invisible influence. Crops fail sporadically, streams shift unpredictably, and small animals vanish from expected patterns, generating anxiety and frustration. The air itself seems heavy, imbued with latent expectation and dread. These psychic and environmental pressures reinforce one another. Land altered by magical and metaphysical currents affects perception, which in turn influences behavior, creating a feedback loop that consolidates control while quietly exacting cost. Yet, even amid this creeping malaise, life persists in modified forms. Hardy plants cling to fissures and ridges, and creatures adapt in ways that reflect the resilience of Middle-earth's ecosystems. These adaptations are responses to subtle pressures rather than direct force, demonstrating the interplay of magic, architecture, and living systems. The land's reaction is therefore not purely destructive. It is adaptive, though in ways that serve the dominance of Barad-dûr. The tower's presence shapes survival and behavior alike, quietly integrating the environment into the broader lattice of influence established through foundation, architecture, and metaphysical bargains. Breadcrumbs emerge here, as elsewhere, signaling deeper mechanisms at work. Patterns of shifted fertility, alignment of watercourses, and distribution of flora and fauna all hint at the underlying architecture of control. Attentive observers might notice anomalies, a fertile patch in an unexpected valley, an unusually aligned stand of trees, or the sudden absence of creatures in a familiar corridor. These traces, subtle and persistent, point back to the hidden bargains and architectural designs that feed the tower's enduring power. They also foreshadow later consequences when the interplay of environmental, psychic, and architectural influences begins to unravel under pressure. The next chapter will examine the human and semi-human cost of these pervasive effects. How do orcs, enslaved men, and the tower's servants experience life within this environment of persistent influence? How does the interplay of architecture, magic, and ecological manipulation shape social dynamics, obedience, and moral compromise? In exploring these questions, we will see how the foundations, architecture, and living systems of Mordor converge not only to support the physical tower, but to extend Sauron's reach into the consciousness and behavior of all who dwell in its shadow. From the environmental consequences of Barad-dûr, our attention turns to the beings who inhabit its shadowed plains, orcs, enslaved men, and those who serve Sauron willingly or through coercion. The tower's influence extends beyond architecture and magic, reaching into consciousness, loyalty, and instinct. Its foundations, built upon bargains, bound spirits, and latent horrors, transmit subtle pressures into the minds of all who dwell nearby. Obedience is rarely demanded directly. It is cultivated through layered forces, an interplay of fear, ritual, and ambient influence. Those who serve Sauron do so under conditions that are never neutral. The environment, the tower, and the history embedded beneath their feet combine to shape perception and behavior in ways both visible and hidden. Binding loyalty is rarely simple or overt. Ritual, repetition, and the proximity of metaphysical currents create conditions in which obedience emerges naturally, almost imperceptibly. Orcs marching across the plains feel compulsion not as an external command, but as a faint resonance aligning with their instincts. Human servants perceive authority without questioning it, guided by subtle manipulation of emotion and anticipation. Even Sauron's lieutenants, aware of their power, are influenced by the hidden lattice of force emanating from the foundations, architecture, and bargains beneath the tower. This influence ensures cohesion and amplifies fear, yet it is not absolute. Cracks appear in understanding, perception, and will, hinting at the latent cost of living in a dominion sustained by unseen pressures. The psychological toll is profound. Constant exposure to these layered influences erodes autonomy, reshapes instinct, and corrodes morale over time. Workers, soldiers, and captives experience fatigue not only in body but in mind. The subtle hum of metaphysical currents presses upon thought, subtly guiding choices and dampening resistance. Obedience becomes intertwined with self-preservation. Moral reasoning shifts under persistent pressure, and ethical clarity diminishes incrementally. The cost is quiet but cumulative, producing individuals who operate efficiently under authority, yet bear invisible scars of compromised volition. This corrosion manifests in whispered doubts, furtive glances, and the occasional rebellion suppressed before it can take root. Moral decay extends even to those who enter willingly. Sauron's lieutenants, motivated by ambition or devotion, must constantly navigate the interplay between personal desire and the imperatives imposed by the tower's presence. Loyalty becomes entwined with fear, achievement measured by the suppression of independent judgment, and reward contingent on alignment with the invisible lattice of influence. Over time, subtle compromises compound, producing an environment in which integrity is eroded without dramatic confrontation. Service to Barad-dûr is therefore not only a physical occupation, but a moral negotiation, one whose costs remain largely unacknowledged until moments of crisis reveal cumulative strain. Hints of lingering unrest and disobedience appear as subtle ripples rather than overt revolts. Orcs may hesitate briefly before orders, human laborers may falter in silent discouragement, and minor insubordination can arise from fatigue or psychic friction. These instances are often isolated and swiftly suppressed, yet they serve as breadcrumbs, signs that even in a dominion meticulously shaped by architecture, magic, and environment, agency persists. Later events will amplify these small fissures, revealing how cracks in obedience, rooted in the toll exacted by hidden foundations, can grow under pressure to challenge authority in ways initially unanticipated. The mechanisms linking metaphysical influence to tangible behavior are subtle. Sauron does not need to micromanage. The lattice of bound spirits, architectural resonance, and environmental distortion acts as an extension of his will. Actions taken in proximity to the tower are guided by invisible cues, from instinctual discomfort to faint emotional nudges. These mechanisms allow control over large numbers without direct intervention, translating foundational and architectural power into political dominance. The costs of this indirect control manifest in the erosion of autonomy, the quiet accumulation of psychological strain, and the shaping of social hierarchies based on fear and manipulation rather than consensus or merit. This dynamic creates a symbiotic relationship between tower and subject. Individuals maintain daily routines and obligations, their labor reinforcing both physical construction and the metaphysical lattice, while the tower's influence shapes behavior, loyalty, and perception. Each participant becomes both instrument and beneficiary, caught in a feedback loop in which compliance produces immediate stability, yet gradually compounds moral and psychological cost. The network of obedience extends from surface structures to subterranean bargains, integrating architecture, magic, and the living environment into a single system of governance. Even Sauron's most powerful servants are not immune. Their strategies, decisions, and long-term planning are subtly shaped by awareness of the tower's pervasive influence. Battles are fought with attention to currents of fear and resonance. Logistics are guided by instinct, reinforced by metaphysical nudges. This creates an invisible economy of power. Energy, loyalty, and obedience flow through the system, shaped by hidden mechanisms, and are converted into actionable control across the plains of Mordor. The cumulative effect is a society in which domination is both structural and psychological, enforced without overt coercion, yet maintained through a combination of architecture, magic, and environmental manipulation. The quiet handoff of this chapter points toward the next exploration, the conversion of these subtle and pervasive influences into tangible political dominance. How does Sauron translate metaphysical leverage into command over armies, fortresses, and territories? How do foundations, architecture, and environmental distortion combine with obedience to create a functioning, coherent dominion. The following chapter will trace the invisible threads of power that link Barad-dûr's hidden lattice to strategic and administrative control, revealing how Sauron's mastery of unseen forces shapes both policy and practice, and how the cost of obedience extends beyond the personal into the political and structural realms. From the obedience of servants and the quiet corrosion of will, we now trace how Barad-dûr's foundations project influence outward into the broader dominion of Mordor. The tower itself functions not merely as a fortress, but as a fulcrum of power, transmitting control through both tangible and invisible channels. Sauron's authority emerges from the integration of architecture, metaphysical latticework, and environmental manipulation, creating a feedback loop in which the strength of the tower reinforces political structures, and those structures, in turn, reinforce the perception and reality of Sauron's dominance. The tower's shadow is never merely literal. It is felt in hearts, minds, and lands, a subtle pulse that shapes allegiance and action. Strategic placement of emissaries, lieutenants, and agents across Mordor amplifies the influence projected from Barad-dûr. Each fortress, encampment, or outpost is not only a defensive position, but a node in a larger network of control, echoing the architectural and metaphysical design of the central tower. The resonance of the foundations flows through these nodes, reinforcing loyalty, emphasizing hierarchy, and conditioning behavior. Psychological resonance functions as a multiplier. When individuals sense the authority of Barad-dûr, even indirectly, they align decisions, movements, and strategies with expectations shaped by the hidden lattice. This system of influence is subtle but pervasive, converting presence into action without overt command. Internal distrust emerges as a consequence of this indirect control. Lieutenants, aware of the reach of Barad-dûr, operate with heightened caution, constantly assessing the intentions of peers and the subtle currents that might indicate advantage or weakness. Ambition, fear, and suspicion intertwine, producing an atmosphere in which obedience is enforced as much by internalized pressure as by external oversight. Overextension is another cost. The broader the dominion, the more nodes must be maintained, the more currents monitored, and the greater the strain on those charged with enforcing indirect control. These pressures echo the costs embedded in the foundations themselves, demonstrating the interplay between metaphysical investment and political vulnerability. The feedback loop between tower and dominion is not only structural, but symbolic. Symbols of authority, banners, fortresses, and emblems carved into stone reinforce the network of influence, reminding subjects of the overarching lattice of power. Each symbol resonates with the architecture of Barad-dûr, echoing its presence even at a distance. The sight of these markers generates the quiet effect of obedience, signaling connection to the hidden mechanisms that sustain dominion. These breadcrumbs of authority, while functional, also hint at potential weaknesses. Over-reliance on symbolic reinforcement creates dependencies that may be exploited when fissures appear in loyalty, structure, or perception. Historical case studies reveal the subtle shaping of events by these foundations. Campaigns led by Sauron's lieutenants demonstrate coordination, guided not only by strategic necessity, but by currents emanating from the tower's hidden lattice. Successes are often amplified by anticipatory alignment. Armies move where they are most psychologically and environmentally inclined to do so, guided by the unseen influence of Barad-dûr. Conversely, failures reveal the fragility of this system. Misalignment, disruption of environmental cues, or local resistance can cause plans to falter, demonstrating that the integration of metaphysical, architectural, and political control is powerful yet contingent. The cost of such pervasive influence is ongoing vigilance. Nodes must be maintained, currents monitored, and allegiances reinforced. Subtle missteps, an emissary acting too independently, a fortress poorly aligned with underlying currents, or a shift in environmental resonance can create local instabilities that ripple outward. Sauron mitigates these risks through redundancy, ritual reinforcement, and careful observation, ensuring that the lattice remains resilient yet flexible enough to accommodate minor disruptions. This delicate balance reflects the inherent tension between concentration of power and the accumulation of strain, a recurring motif rooted in the tower's foundations. In practice, the economy of dark power relies on translation. The hidden horror beneath Barad-dûr must manifest as actionable authority, guiding decisions, behavior, and strategic outcomes. This translation is mediated through human and non-human intermediaries whose perception of hierarchy, fear, and expectation is subtly manipulated by the convergence of architectural, magical, and environmental cues. The result is a dominion in which physical infrastructure, psychological conditioning, and metaphysical resonance operate in tandem, producing obedience and strategic coherence without requiring omnipresent oversight. Subtle vulnerabilities are seeded within this system, often by design. Irregularities in architecture, inconsistencies in environmental alignment, and the accumulation of psychological strain create points where the feedback loop may falter. These vulnerabilities remain latent, often imperceptible until pressures, whether external threats, internal ambition, or environmental disruption, amplify them. The deliberate integration of hidden weaknesses is a form of resilience, paradoxically, ensuring that the system can adapt under stress while maintaining the appearance of perfection. In doing so, Sauron creates a dominion that is both formidable and inherently contingent, a structure of influence as dependent on balance as it is on fear. The tower's shadow also enforces compliance indirectly through perception. Even those never in direct contact with Barad-dûr are influenced by the knowledge of its existence, by tales of its foundations, and by the subtle environmental cues that radiate outward. Fear of the unknown, augmented by indirect resonance from the tower, aligns action across distances, creating an anticipatory obedience that reinforces both the psychological and political lattice. In this way, influence extends beyond tangible reach, shaping choices, expectations, and alliances throughout Mordor. In summary, the economy of dark power is a confluence of architecture, magic, environment, and social dynamics. Barad-dûr's foundations provide the core, transmitting influence outward into human and non-human behavior, fortresses, and broader political networks. Control is amplified through symbolic reinforcement, subtle psychological pressure, and alignment with environmental and metaphysical currents. The costs, distrust, overextension, latent vulnerabilities, mirror those embedded in the tower itself, creating a system that is powerful, yet perpetually contingent. The next chapter will examine specific historical events, demonstrating how the hidden influence of Barad-dûr shaped campaigns, sieges, and the strategic landscape above ground. By tracing these case studies, we will observe the tangible outcomes of metaphysical leverage and architectural mastery, revealing how the hidden horrors beneath the tower extend their reach into the unfolding history of Mordor and beyond. From the exercise of power in politics and obedience, our attention now shifts to the battlefield, where the hidden foundations of Barad-dûr exert influence in ways subtle yet decisive. Wars and sieges across Mordor and in territories beyond its immediate borders reveal how the tower's presence magnifies events, shaping outcomes through mechanisms that are rarely visible to the participants. The influence of the hidden lattice beneath the tower extends outward, affecting perception, morale, and the rhythm of combat, producing consequences that ripple far beyond the initial sparks of engagement. One mechanism is the channeling of fear. Armies approaching Mordor sense, often unconsciously, the shadow projected by Barad-dûr. The psychological imprint of the tower's foundations interacts with the terrain, the alignment of forces, and the resonance of magical currents, producing subtle hesitation, disrupted formations, and amplified anxiety. Fatigue is likewise intensified. Soldiers, already burdened by long marches or poor supplies, find their resolve eroded more rapidly under the ambient influence of the tower. The presence of bound spirits, residual currents of ancient power, and architectural resonance combine to shape perception, guiding actions in ways that favor Sauron's objectives, even without direct orders or engagement. Destabilization of allies is another effect. Those who serve the Free Peoples or independent factions often experience subtle disruption of cohesion, misalignment of strategy, and conflicting judgment. Small missteps, misread signals, delayed movement, or hesitation at critical moments can escalate into larger failures, illustrating how the hidden foundations magnify the consequences of minor errors. These effects operate quietly, rarely recorded in chronicles as deliberate manipulation, yet they consistently tip outcomes in favor of Mordor's forces, demonstrating the subtle potency of Barad-dûr's influence. Collateral destruction is an inevitable cost. The amplification of fear, fatigue, and misperception creates cascading effects on the landscape and civilian populations. Villages may be abandoned preemptively, crops fail under delayed attention or mismanagement, and environmental imbalances, already seeded by the tower's influence, are exacerbated by the movement of armies and the disruption of local resources. Even when Sauron's forces achieve decisive victories, the cost to the broader ecology and social fabric of the region reflects the indirect consequences of his subterranean control. Unintended rebellions sometimes emerge as well, often from small fissures in obedience that were previously dormant. Soldiers or captives, influenced by hidden currents yet still retaining fragments of autonomy, may act in ways unforeseen by commanders. These incidents are rarely predictable, demonstrating that even a dominion as meticulously structured as Mordor contains pockets of potential instability. Over time, such small disruptions provide breadcrumbs for future events, instances that appear insignificant until later analysis reveals their connection to the interplay of architecture, magic, and social dynamics under Barad-dûr's shadow. Historical case studies illustrate these dynamics. In early campaigns along the northern borders of Mordor, forces loyal to Sauron leveraged both psychological resonance and environmental alignment to overwhelm defenders. Forested terrain was subtly distorted by the interaction of magical currents with natural obstacles, guiding movements and sapping morale. Troop exhaustion accumulated more quickly than anticipated, and minor errors in enemy strategy, magnified by the tower's influence, created openings that commanders exploited efficiently. These successes, though appearing conventional, are in part the product of the hidden lattice below, demonstrating how subterranean mechanisms extend influence into tangible outcomes above ground. Sieges reveal another dimension. Attackers often find themselves subtly misaligned with optimal approaches, encountering structural advantages, fatigue, and fear amplified by Barad-dûr's architecture and metaphysical resonance. Conversely, Sauron's defenders operate with coordination that seems instinctual, as currents of influence guide judgment, reinforce cohesion, and amplify vigilance. The tower functions as both guardian and strategist, extending its presence through environmental, psychological, and magical channels. Collateral damage, as well as the erosion of morale among attackers, is therefore not incidental, but an integrated effect of the foundations beneath the fortress. Breadcrumbs of future significance are embedded in these conflicts. Minor incidents, an unremarkable hesitation of a commander, a sudden misalignment of a battalion, or the unexpected survival of a small unit, gain new meaning in later chapters. These events, when revisited, reveal the layered influence of Barad-dûr, how hidden foundations amplify, distort, or redirect outcomes in ways that are imperceptible in the moment, but consequential over time. Each ripple contributes to a broader narrative of control, cost, and the unexpected persistence of resistance within an environment carefully structured for dominance. The cumulative effect of these campaigns is to reinforce Sauron's dominion, consolidating authority, while simultaneously imposing strain on his forces and the environment. Success is rarely absolute. Every victory carries embedded costs, ecological disruption, fatigue, and subtle unrest among troops and enslaved populations. Yet these outcomes, while complex, demonstrate the effectiveness of the hidden foundations in translating subterranean horror into strategic advantage. The visible triumphs of Mordor are inseparable from the invisible latticework below, reminding us that the power of Barad-dûr is as much metaphysical and psychological as it is physical. As the chapter closes, we are left with an awareness of the tower's enduring reach. Battles are fought, sieges endured, and strategies executed, all while invisible threads of influence course through stone, soil, and mind. The subtlety of this power is its most profound feature. Its effects are felt without overt recognition, guiding outcomes, shaping perception, and creating consequences that echo across time. In doing so, the foundations of Barad-dûr extend their influence far beyond the immediate site of construction, shaping both the history and the psychology of Mordor's domain. The next chapter will examine the hidden symbols embedded in the tower's design, tracing how architectural and mystical motifs resonate outward, both reinforcing authority and prefiguring vulnerabilities. By exploring these symbols, we will uncover another layer of connection between foundations and influence, between Barad-dûr and the subtle architecture of power that extends from it into every corner of the realm. Having traced the foundations, architecture, environment, and human consequences of Barad-dûr, we now turn to the subtler layer of control embedded in the fortress, the sigils, glyphs, and arcane symbols that permeate stone and shadow alike. These markings are rarely apparent to casual observers. They are layered with meaning, each serving as both record and mechanism, encoding knowledge of bargains, reinforcing metaphysical bonds, and stabilizing the pervasive influence of the tower. Where stone, shadow, and geography establish presence, glyphs encode authority, extending Sauron's dominion through subtle, almost imperceptible channels. The sigils are crafted with meticulous precision, arranged to align with both the subterranean lattice and the architectural flow of Barad-dûr. Each rune resonates with ambient currents, activating when energy, intent, or proximity reaches certain thresholds. This resonance is not merely symbolic, it serves practical functions. It reinforces bindings of spirits within the foundations, stabilizes architectural stresses, and amplifies psychological influence over those in the tower's shadow. Glyphs function as conduits, extending the metaphysical lattice into conscious and unconscious perception, guiding behavior and perception in ways that remain largely invisible to all but the most attentive or magically sensitive. Layered meanings characterize these symbols. On one level, they serve as records of bargains struck, contracts with bound entities, remnants of Morgoth's influence, and subtle nods to the moral and magical compromises underlying construction. On another, they act as functional tools, reinforcing currents of power through precise placement, geometry, and repetition. A single rune may anchor a spirit, amplify a channel of fear, or subtly distort environmental resonance. Patterns recur across walls, spires, and hidden chambers, creating motifs whose repetition intensifies effect, much as the rhythm of architecture amplifies shadow and light. The costs of maintaining this network of glyphs are notable. Secrecy demands vigilance. Caretakers and sorcerers must monitor integrity, replacing or repairing glyphs whose potency wanes or whose alignment shifts. Misreading or misplacement triggers minor but cumulative disruptions, architectural tremors, environmental distortions, or subtle confusion among inhabitants. Each error, though not immediately catastrophic, imposes incremental strain on the broader lattice. Thus, the effectiveness of these symbols depends on continual attention, expertise, and labor, echoing the recurring theme of cost embedded in every level of Barad-dûr's construction. Glyphs also encode contingency. Through variation in form and placement, Sauron can modulate effects across the fortress. Certain markings reinforce loyalty and obedience, others amplify vigilance or alertness among defenders. Some record subtle feedback from the foundations themselves, responding to shifts in energy, weather, or psychic pressure. The complexity of this system creates resilience. A single disrupted rune rarely compromises function, yet the aggregate network ensures that the fortress operates in harmony with its foundations, environment, and the behavioral patterns of its inhabitants. The symbolic layer extends beyond immediate control. Glyphs function as a semiotic memory of the tower's history, encoding traces of ancient bargains, buried horrors, and prior misalignments. Observers sensitive to these signs may discern echoes of past failures or successes, hints of unrest, or indications of latent vulnerabilities. The placement of runes in less obvious locations, behind battlements, within hollowed spires, or beneath floors, ensures that only attentive examination or prolonged exposure reveals their function. For most, their effect is subconscious, guiding perception, influencing decision-making, and reinforcing the lattice of obedience and fear established across Mordor. Breadcrumbs within these glyphs foreshadow connections to the One Ring. Patterns embedded in the tower's stone and shadow mirror, designs later inscribed in the ring, linking its power directly to the metaphysical and architectural systems of Barad-dûr. Subtle variations in alignment, repetition, and resonance suggest how the ring channels, amplifies, and externalizes Sauron's will. At the same time, glyphs encode latent vulnerabilities, ensuring that the very mechanisms that stabilize influence also contain the potential for disruption, should key elements be removed or manipulated. These symbols serve both as instruments of control and as hints of limits, a recurring motif in the design of Mordor's dominion. Arcane resonance is the primary mechanism by which glyphs operate. The form of each symbol, the angles of lines, and the relationship to other nearby runes determine how energy flows, both within the stone and into surrounding spaces. Channels of influence extend outward from glyphs, intersecting with foundations, architectural vectors, and environmental currents to produce amplified effects. Even minor symbols can have disproportionate impact if aligned precisely, creating localized intensifications of fear, vigilance, or psychic strain. This layered system transforms stone into a semi-living network where meaning, power, and control intersect seamlessly. Maintenance of the glyph network is a continuous obligation. Sauron's agents inspect, refresh, and recalibrate markings to compensate for shifts in magical resonance, environmental conditions, or changes in the behavior of inhabitants. Vigilance is especially necessary in chambers supporting foundational bindings. Disruption could weaken both the physical stability of Barad-dûr and the psychological cohesion of its occupants. Thus, glyphs are both functional and fragile, demanding stewardship and knowledge. Their effectiveness depends on subtlety, precision, and ongoing attention, reinforcing the broader theme that power is inseparable from cost in the architecture of Mordor. The next chapter will examine the cost of these hidden mechanisms on Sauron himself. As the glyphs extend his influence outward, how do they feed back into the long-term plans, vulnerabilities, and endurance of the Dark Lord? We will consider the interplay between mastery and strain, examining how the very structures that extend his will simultaneously impose limitations and risks over centuries. In doing so, we will trace the final layers of connection between foundation, architecture, symbol, and consciousness, revealing the personal toll of sustaining dominion across time and space. Having traced Barad-dûr's foundations, glyphs, and the influence exerted over inhabitants and the wider dominion, we now turn inward to the tower's master. Sauron, architect of stone, shadow, and control, bears a cost invisible to the casual observer. While others endure the direct and indirect consequences of his dominion, orcs, enslaved men, and even the land itself, the Dark Lord carries a burden rooted in the very structures that extend his will. The act of mastery is inseparable from expenditure, the absorption of ambient horror, the maintenance of vigilance, and the constant negotiation with ancient bargains, exact, subtle, but cumulative personal tolls. The psychic weight is relentless. Barad-dûr functions not only as a node of power, but as a receptor, channeling energy from bound spirits, subterranean horrors, and residual currents of Morgoth's influence. Sauron must constantly modulate, contain, and redirect these forces to prevent destabilization. Every fluctuation in the lattice, every tremor in the foundations, every misalignment in glyphs requires his attention. The mental and spiritual strain of managing multiple layers of influence is profound. Perception, judgment, and decision-making are filtered through a dense mesh of energy, resonance, and consequence. Each action, each directive ripples through this network, demanding foresight and calibration. Hubris emerges as both mechanism and hazard. Mastery over bound spirits, architectural lattices, and subtle currents of environmental and psychological influence reinforces a sense of invulnerability. Sauron's capacity to manipulate, enforce, and predict may have encouraged an expanding vision, one that presses ever outward, integrating more territory, more forces, more environmental nodes. Yet the very complexity of this dominion imposes limits. Subtle misjudgments, unnoticed vibrations in the lattice, or fatigue in maintaining resonance can accumulate, magnifying the potential for error. In this way, the exercise of omnipotence carries a hidden fragility entwined with the deliberate design of Barad-dûr. Strategic vigilance compounds these pressures. Unlike mortal rulers, Sauron cannot rely on delegation alone. Every decision interacts with layers of magical, psychological, and environmental influence. Campaigns must account not only for enemies, but for currents of obedience and unrest among his own forces, the interaction of glyphs with the landscape, and the latent power embedded in the foundations. Even small oversights risk undermining localized influence, creating ripples that propagate outward. The act of governance, therefore, is inseparable from psychic exertion. Every choice is filtered through an intricate lattice of cause and effect, both visible and hidden. Absorption of ambient horror is another cost. The energies bound beneath Barad-dûr, spirits, lingering darkness, and echoes of prior ages of violence, are necessary to the tower's strength, but exact a toll on the wielder. Sauron interfaces with these energies, integrating them into conscious planning, strategic foresight, and metaphysical management. This constant contact gradually shapes perception, temperament, and judgment. Subtle shifts in empathy, clarity, or instinct accumulate over centuries, producing a ruler increasingly intertwined with the very forces he manipulates. The cost is personal, hubris, fatigue, and a slow corrosion of perspective, even for one of his potency. Spiritual compromise is layered and insidious. Sauron's bargains and the binding of spirit into architecture and glyphs extend dominion outward while reflecting inward. The energies that reinforce his control also echo back, reinforcing aspects of pride, rigidity, and obsession. Decisions are influenced not only by calculation, but by resonance with these bound forces. Over time, the line between mastery and dependence blurs. The same currents that enable extraordinary reach also impose subtle constraints, guiding choice and reinforcing patterns of behavior that favor preservation of the lattice over adaptability or empathy. Caution, calculation, and vigilance remain essential. The cost of overreach is not immediate annihilation, but the slow accumulation of stress, misalignment, and vulnerability. Each campaign, each construction effort, and each manipulation of consciousness requires ongoing attention. Minor failures in maintaining glyphs, foundations, or environmental alignment can accumulate, magnifying small errors into consequential outcomes. Sauron's personal burden, therefore, is a continuous negotiation between exertion and restraint, between extending influence and containing instability. Breadcrumbs of eventual overreach appear throughout this exercise of dominion. Subtle lapses in judgment, tiny misalignments in strategy, or the occasional ripple of unrest among obedient forces foreshadow the climactic struggle. The same structures that extend control outward embed potential failure. Dependencies on foundations, glyphs, and the absorption of ambient horror create points of latent vulnerability. Though invisible to most, these threads hint at the eventual limitations of even the Dark Lord's power, connecting directly to the interplay between Barad-dûr, its hidden lattice, and the One Ring. The physical and metaphysical labor required to sustain dominion is also intertwined. Sauron's long-term planning demands constant monitoring of architecture, glyphs, and foundations, integrating updates to strategy with adjustments to the lattice. Even minor disruptions, fissures in stone, environmental anomalies, or shifts in perception among inhabitants require intervention. The burden is continuous and multifaceted, a combination of psychic management, environmental monitoring, and strategic foresight that extends beyond conventional governance. Finally, the burden manifests in the subtle erosion of perspective. Over centuries, the integration of bound horrors, architectural currents, and environmental influence can amplify tendencies toward obsession, rigidity, and a narrowing of focus. While Sauron's strategic genius is undeniable, the hidden costs of managing the lattice, overlapping layers of influence, anticipation of innumerable contingencies, and absorption of ambient horror gradually shape thought and temperament. Decisions, though still formidable, are colored by the weight of centuries-long exertion and the necessity of maintaining dominion at every level. The next chapter will examine the interplay of Barad-dûr's foundations with the One Ring, tracing how these hidden mechanisms amplify, constrain, and ultimately interact with the ring's unique power. By exploring this connection, we will see how Sauron's personal burden, the tower's architecture, and the subterranean lattice converge, culminating in both extraordinary reach and latent vulnerability, prefiguring the eventual unmaking of his dominion. From the burdens borne by Sauron himself, we shift to the object that concentrates, extends, and simultaneously reflects his power. The One Ring, Barad-dûr's hidden foundations, the glyphs woven into its walls, and the lattice of influence through Mordor, converge in the creation and sustenance of the ring. This singular artifact is both product and amplifier of the tower's underlying systems, where the foundations channel fear, loyalty, and magical resonance outward. The ring concentrates those forces, allowing Sauron to exert influence far beyond the immediate domain of Mordor, yet also tethering him to the vulnerabilities inherent in the structures he has built. The ring functions through symbiotic magical resonance. Its creation captured a portion of Sauron's essence, binding it into a malleable, portable form. In doing so, it mirrors the foundations beneath Barad-dûr. Just as the tower draws on bound spirits and subterranean currents, the ring integrates ambient power, architectural influence, and metaphysical energy. Each artifact reflects and amplifies the currents of domination established within Mordor, making the ring a focal point of Sauron's lattice, extending the reach of his awareness and command, while also increasing the consequences of any disruption in that network. fear and perception are magnified through the ring's presence. Like Barad-dûr itself, it projects authority and psychological pressure, subtly influencing those near enough to sense its resonance. Soldiers, emissaries, and adversaries react to it unconsciously, adjusting behavior in ways favorable to Sauron's will. The mechanisms of obedience, alignment, and anticipation traced in previous chapters find a concentrated expression in the ring. Where the tower relied on subtle architectural and environmental cues, the ring exerts direct and portable influence, linking perception, motivation, and behavior to its master's intent. Yet the amplification comes at cost. The ring's power depends upon the same foundations that sustain Barad-dûr, embedding systemic fragility into its very nature. Disruption of the tower, shifts in glyph resonance, or disturbance of bound spirits can have magnified consequences, reflecting outward into both the Dominion and Sauron himself. Likewise, reliance on this concentrated artifact produces overextension. The lattice of influence grows ever more complex, and the energy required to maintain balance increases. While the ring permits extraordinary reach, it simultaneously magnifies the consequences of imbalance, fatigue, or misjudgment. The One Ring also contains latent vulnerabilities, seeded by the hidden architecture of Barad-dûr. Small imperfections in alignment, residual instability in foundational bargains, or subtle misplacement of glyphs create potential for disruption. These weaknesses are rarely perceptible to Sauron in his long-term oversight, but they accumulate over time, producing conditions in which unintended consequences become increasingly likely. Just as minor fissures in obedience or environmental distortion can ripple outward in Mordor, latent flaws in the ring's construction carry the potential to undermine its power when exploited under precise circumstances. Connections between the ring and the foundations extend beyond power alone. Glyphs and sigils within Barad-dûr mirror patterns later inscribed in the ring, encoding not only control, but contingency. The architecture of influence is translated into a form portable enough to interact with individuals and events far removed from Mordor. In doing so, the ring becomes both extension and echo of Barad-dûr, a reflection of the same lattices of fear, loyalty, and psychic modulation explored in earlier chapters. It embodies the duality of amplification and risk inherent in the Dark Lord's methods. Collateral consequences of the ring's creation parallel the costs of sustaining the tower. The artifact exerts pressure not only on the bearer, but on the surrounding environment, society, and perception. Subtle shifts in loyalty, inclination, and strategy emerge wherever it moves. Individuals unconsciously aligned with or resisting the ring experience fatigue, confusion, and temptation, echoing the influence Barad-dûr itself exerts over the lands of Mordor. In this sense, the ring functions as an extension of the hidden lattice, amplifying influence while also multiplying points of potential failure. Breadcrumbs for eventual undoing are subtly embedded. The vulnerabilities seeded in the tower's foundations, the delicate interplay of glyph resonance, and the accumulation of ambient horror all intersect in the ring. Early disruptions, minor misjudgments, unobserved fissures in loyalty, or faint lapses in vigilance, gain significance over time, prefiguring the conditions for the ring's eventual unmaking. These threads, planted in architecture, glyphs, and personal burden, connect directly to the ultimate unraveling of Sauron's dominion, revealing how intertwined amplification and fragility are in the exercise of concentrated power. The symbiosis between ring and tower illustrates a recurring principle. Extraordinary reach is inseparable from extraordinary responsibility and risk. Just as the foundations of Barad-dûr demanded vigilance, personal expenditure, and oversight, the ring concentrates and multiplies these requirements. Its power is formidable, yet inherently contingent, dependent on the integrity of the lattice, the alignment of forces, and the sustained focus of its master. Disruption at any node, foundational, architectural, or personal, carries consequences magnified through both tower and artifact. In summary, the One Ring is both culmination and extension of Barad-dûr's hidden horrors. It integrates architecture, glyphs, environmental resonance, and psychological influence into a portable and concentrated focus of power. While it amplifies Sauron's reach across Middle-earth, it also mirrors the costs embedded in the tower itself: systemic fragility, dependence on subtle alignment, and latent vulnerabilities that accumulate across centuries. By tracing the symbiosis between foundations and ring, we see how power, control, and risk intertwine, producing extraordinary influence alongside inevitable fragility. The next chapter will explore the unraveling of Sauron's plans as these vulnerabilities manifest, examining the consequences for Mordor, Middle-earth, and the enduring legacy of Barad-dûr's hidden foundations. In doing so, we will witness how the convergence of architecture, metaphysical lattice, and artifact power sets the stage for both collapse and reflection, linking hidden horror to historical consequence. From the symbiosis of Barad-dûr and the One Ring, we now observe the slow unraveling of the tower's hidden mechanisms, a cascade triggered by the convergence of rebellion, war, and the ring's eventual dislocation. The foundations that once anchored dominion, stone, glyphs, bound spirits, and architectural lattices, are revealed to be deeply interdependent. When a single node falters, particularly the ring, the intricate web of influence begins to ripple, producing consequences that extend from the subterranean lattice to the highest spires of the fortress. The interdependence of magical, political, and psychological threads is striking. Bound spirits and subterranean currents that once reinforced loyalty and obedience lose coherence, subtly weakening the psychological conditioning of soldiers, emissaries, and servants. Glyphs resonate with diminished intensity, environmental currents distort, and the architectural lattice is stressed by the absence of concentrated focus. Even minor misalignments magnify as connections fray. Corridors once harmonized with resonance now vibrate unevenly. Chambers designed to amplify fear lose effect, and the very stone seems to sigh under the weight of destabilized intent. Political systems suffer in parallel. Lieutenants, previously guided and subtly constrained by the lattice of influence, encounter unexpected uncertainty. Decisions made in confidence falter, coordination fails, and minor conflicts escalate into larger disturbances. The subtle obedience, once ensured by fear and indirect manipulation, begins to unravel, producing small rebellions, hesitation, and disjointed action. As these disruptions compound, the domino effect of interdependent failure becomes increasingly evident. What seemed isolated proves inseparable from the broader lattice of control. Psychological threads stretch and tear under strain. Those who had internalized the authority of Barad-dûr sense its diminishing reach, experiencing increased doubt, hesitation, and even latent courage. The alignment of perception, once carefully orchestrated by the tower's shadow and glyphic resonance, now diverges, producing ripples of behavior that echo outward through Mordor. Soldiers falter in formation, lieutenants hesitate in command, and the collective coherence of the Dark Lord's dominion begins to fracture. Mechanisms of failure are as subtle as the systems themselves. When the ring is separated from its master, the concentration of magical energy that stabilized the lattice diminishes. Glyphs no longer receive the harmonized influx from the artifact, and the Foundation's bound spirits sense a loosening of control. Architectural reinforcement, previously complemented by layered magical currents, strains as environmental and psychic alignments fall out of synchrony. Even the stone seems to reflect imbalance. Minor tremors propagate through foundations, corridors, and battlements, echoing the fragility embedded in every level of construction. The costs of this unraveling are extensive, yet layered. Physical destruction occurs where structural integrity fails or battles spill into uncontrolled chaos. Political coherence erodes, leaving governance fragmented and reactive rather than deliberate. Environmental and ecological stress, already strained by centuries of interference, accelerates, producing subtle but persistent distortions in terrain and resource availability. Above all, a lingering shadow remains, the memory of dominion, the resonance of power, and the echoes of bargains once struck cannot be fully erased. These residual effects persist, leaving Mordor scarred and the wider world aware of the consequences of concentrated, hidden horror. Breadcrumbs of collapse appear throughout the process. Fractured sigils no longer maintain coherence. Patterns once reinforcing controls now act inconsistently or in isolation. Bound spirits, freed from stabilizing influence, stir and react unpredictably. Lieutenants, weakened or destabilized, act with autonomy that was previously unthinkable, introducing misalignment into operations and revealing latent vulnerabilities. Minor, previously unremarkable incidents gain retrospective significance. A hesitant decision, a misaligned attack, or an overlooked fissure in stone becomes evidence of the interdependence of Sauron's dominion and the fragility embedded in its foundations. The cascade extends to symbolic and psychological structures as well. The looming presence of Barad-dûr, once an unbroken projection of fear and authority, fractures in perception. Observers, enemy and ally alike, sense inconsistency, subtle irregularities, and moments of vulnerability. These cracks amplify morale among opposing forces and embolden resistance, even where the fortress's physical defenses remain largely intact. The intertwining of perception, architecture, and magical reinforcement underscores a principle traced throughout earlier chapters. Dominion is inseparable from its hidden structures, and when one fails, the rest follow. Despite the collapse, echoes persist. The foundations, glyphs, and lattice continue to shape events, albeit unpredictably. Residual influence can mislead, provoke unintended outcomes, or channel fear and obedience in inconsistent patterns. This lingering effect illustrates the durability of Barad-dûr's design, even in failure. The hidden horror embedded over centuries does not vanish at once, and the world remains subtly imprinted with its architecture of control. These remnants will inform later narratives, cautioning against both underestimating and overestimating the potency of such layered dominion. As the chapter closes, we are left with an understanding of fragility within seemingly indomitable power. Barad-dûr's strength, derived from foundations, glyphs, and symbiosis with the ring, proves both formidable and contingent. Collapse is neither sudden nor complete, but occurs through cascading interdependencies that amplify minor disruptions into systemic consequence. The cost is measurable in destruction, chaos, and the psychological imprint left across Mordor and Middle-earth, a lingering testament to the dangers of hidden, concentrated power. The next chapter will synthesize these insights, preparing a reflective conclusion. By integrating architecture, glyphs, foundations, the ring, and Sauron's personal toll, we will examine the lessons embedded in the rise, dominance, and unraveling of Barad-dûr. In doing so, we will close the circle on the hidden horrors beneath the Dark Tower, leaving the listener with both understanding and contemplative resonance of the costs, mechanisms, and enduring shadows of concentrated dominion. With the unraveling of Barad-dûr and the dispersal of Sauron's influence, we step back to observe the quiet aftermath, tracing the lingering resonance of dominion and the subtle shaping of history that the Dark Tower imposed. The fortress, once a nexus of stone, shadow, and metaphysical terror, now exists primarily in memory, in the traces left across Mordor, and in the enduring impressions of those who survived its reign. Here, reflection is both mechanism and purpose. By examining the foundations, glyphs, and networks of influence, we gain insight not only into the power exerted, but into the costs embedded in ambition, both visible and hidden. The land itself bears witness. Valleys and plains, once shaped and distorted by subterranean currents, slowly resume their rhythms, though scars remain. Streams that once ran through geomantic disturbances carry echoes of energy. Subtle shifts in soil and stone persist, and ancient fissures mark the places where foundational bargains once bound spirits and spirits' energies. Flora and fauna respond in turn, tentative in their recovery, suggesting that even after the collapse of concentrated dominion, history continues to shape the environment. This quiet testimony of nature mirrors the broader theme of consequence, that power, once exercised, leaves traces beyond immediate perception, often enduring far longer than its architects. Reflection also resides in the human and non-human memory of the event. Those who served, suffered, or resisted carry with them impressions of obedience, fear, and resilience. The psychological and cultural landscapes of Mordor are subtly transformed, echoing the hidden mechanisms once enforced by foundations and glyphs. These impressions are cumulative, layering experience across generations and serving as quiet reminders of the interplay between architecture, authority, and consequence. Even where structures no longer function, their lessons remain embedded in memory, a bridge between material history and the shaping of future decisions, motifs traced throughout the rise and fall of Barad-dûr now converge in reflection. Sigils, now fractured or erased, still resonate faintly in surviving stones, hinting at knowledge once encoded and control once maintained. Architectural alignments reveal both brilliance and vulnerability, illustrating that every act of dominance carries the potential for unseen consequence. Bound spirits, liberated or dissipated, leave echoes in the lattice of the land, reminding us that even failures and dismantling are mediated through the very systems that once imposed order. By tracing these threads, reflection allows integration. The patterns of construction, maintenance, and collapse form a coherent narrative, demonstrating the cost of ambition and the enduring influence of hidden horror. Quiet contemplation also illuminates the personal toll on the architect of dominion. Sauron's labor, spanning centuries, encompassed psychic expenditure, absorption of ambient horror, and relentless oversight of both the tangible and intangible. His dominion, while extraordinary, illustrates a broader principle. Mastery is inseparable from cost, and the exercise of extreme power carries inherent vulnerability. By examining the foundations, the glyphs, and the symbiotic connection with the One Ring, reflection reveals that the height of influence is inseparable from the fragility it entails. This awareness invites a tempered understanding of ambition, demonstrating that the pursuit of control, no matter how meticulous, leaves both visible and hidden consequences. Integration of insights also traces the interdependence of mechanisms across levels: architectural lattices, magical currents, glyphic resonance, psychological conditioning, and environmental shaping. Together form a complex system whose operation is inseparable from the costs imposed. Reflection illuminates these interconnections, showing that Barad-dûr's power was neither arbitrary nor isolated. It was sustained by carefully layered mechanisms that amplified influence while embedding vulnerabilities. Each element, stone, shadow, glyph, spirit, contributed to a network whose failure unfolds predictably when a key node, such as the One Ring, is removed. Understanding this layering allows us to perceive the tower not merely as a physical structure, but as a lesson in the architecture of power, control, and consequence. The costs of ambition are subtle and enduring. Even after the collapse, lingering unease persists in the lands once dominated. Scars in stone and soil, echoes of bound spirits, and the faint resonance of glyphic patterns contribute to an intangible historical memory. Observers may perceive fleeting impressions of fear, control, or imbalance, while survivors retain narratives suffused with caution and reverence. The tower's influence, though dissipated, underscores that actions taken in pursuit of extreme power leave legacies not entirely subject to erasure, reminding us that historical memory often carries the shadow of intent long after it ceases to function. Lessons for future ages emerge quietly within these reflections, motifs revisited across architecture, glyphs, and environmental shaping suggest principles of interdependence, consequence, and fragility. They indicate that even the most absolute structures are subject to the limitations of their foundations, the vulnerabilities of their operators, and the unpredictable reactions of living systems. The synthesis of these insights forms a narrative not of sensational collapse, but of measured understanding, that history, power, and ambition are intertwined in subtle and often invisible ways, accessible to those who attend to the layers beneath observable outcomes. Finally, the quiet aftermath extends a soft pointer to other hidden histories in Middle-earth. The interplay between ambition, hidden mechanisms, and unintended consequences is mirrored in other ruins, relics, and dominions, each carrying its own network of cause and effect. By observing Barad-dûr's rise and fall, the listener gains a template for understanding the subtle shaping of history across ages, where control, ambition, and the layering of influence produce both tangible outcomes and enduring traces in landscape, memory, and culture. Reflection in this sense is both conclusion and invitation to perceive the continuity of history, the fragility of dominion, and the quiet persistence of the unseen. In closing, the story of Barad-dûr reveals that power, even when seemingly absolute, is inseparable from cost, vulnerability, and enduring consequence. The foundations beneath the dark tower encoded horror, exerted influence, and shaped perception across Middle-earth. Yet their collapse demonstrates that interdependent systems are inherently fragile. By attending to the interplay of architecture, glyphs, environmental shaping, and personal burden, we gain a deeper understanding of both the tower itself and the principles it exemplifies. That dominion is never free of consequence, that hidden mechanisms leave lasting imprints, and that even in apparent ruin, history retains the lessons of its architects,